Christ is risen. All right, we're back. A joyful feast of the Feast of Mid-Pentecost, everybody. Let's jump in. I apologize for my voice. It's kind of going out. We are continuing our Hebrews 11 study. I thought I would try and use the screen again after last week's trial with those direct slides. I had some requests that we have my face on the screen, so it's a little bit easier for people to kind of follow. So I will do that, although the trade-off here is that some of the slides will not appear quite so clear on your computer screen because there's a reflection here on the wall that, as you'll see when I have a white-based slide, it's going to be pretty intelligible. So jumping right on in, everybody, our goal today is to complete the study of chapter 11, and that is going to bring us into really the beginning of the descent into the conclusion of the book of Hebrews with chapter 12. This is the big section that awaits us today, is with by faith and by faith and by faith and so on, that we have begun to analyze last week. We looked over at especially some of the different aspects of the structure of this chapter, starting with the word Greek pistis. I don't know if you can even see that, but on the slide I'm looking at it and it doesn't look like you can see it, but there it will be on your handouts. The emails, and the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of those things not seen, and we went over that. Not to go over it again, but just as a refresher, this was an easy to digest slide, I hope. And we are, of course, using this chiastic structure analysis, which we did, right? The slice of the onion, A prime, B prime, etc., leading to the core of a passage. We saw that it's very likely that not only is the whole book of Hebrews chiastic, but also the 11th chapter itself is chiastic. And when we analyze that in a chiastic way, we are going to see that the core of chapter 11 is that of Exodus. Again, I don't know if you can clearly see this slide, but this is the chiastic analysis of this entire chapter leading to the core, which is Exodus. And we looked at Abraham and his role there. So this is where we pick up today. And this has to do with our assumption here that what St. Paul is trying to say is the Exodus was ongoing. Meaning, when he structures the 11th chapter in the way that he does, this is not a completed situation. So, as you might recall, is from the book title to the Hebrews, this is specifically to those who identified as Hebrews, not just Jews. Remember, we went over that at the very beginning. This is those who identify in the broadest sense as Hebrews, meaning those who identify as Abraham's children. That's what Hebrews means from over the river, referring to Abraham's own personal exodus. That is why he chooses that broad sense of the word. And here in this 11th chapter, he's trying to emphasize we are not done with the Exodus. It have been celebrated as this annual event at Passover, right, with the ritual. And of course, we know this clearly from our Holy Week events as they unfold, when the goal of the Pharisees was to be able to eat the Passover meal. But that is indicative of their mentality. Their mentality was, let's get this troublesome figure, Jesus of Nazareth, out of our way so that we can now celebrate the return in memory of the event of the deliverance of our people from Egypt, as if it were a done deal, as if it were finished. And therein lies the difference between their understanding of the Exodus and ours, and what St. Paul is getting at here. They thought of it as a completed matter. We understand the Exodus to have been a key moment in describing the entirety of God's plan of salvation, which renders each of us on our own exodus and the church on an exodus to his second coming. That's the difference that I think is so important, because otherwise we'll have a static view of the Old Testament, as if they were events that just happened, and we can sort of look back and go, oh, that's kind of cool, and all right. But as we were going to see here through the help of St. John Chrysostom and St. Gregory Palamas, it's absolutely not just an event that happened. It is an event that is ongoing from the moment of the fall until the time he comes again. It's the bookends of history. That's why we're understanding things not just in a personal way, but in the entirety of the human story, from the beginning of time until the end of time. That is a one-word summary that we can call Exodus. So the construction of the temple didn't end the journey of the people of God. It is going to be when he comes again. That's why he's establishing in his literary way the structure of this chapter points to the Exodus, as you saw in last week's discussion. This little diagram that we've been referring to each time, that there's this interactive relationship between faith, as we've understood it, that substance of something that is not seen, the substance of a conviction that there is something not seen but is there, that is the object of our desire and our exodus. That is what faith is. It's that conviction that it's there, even though it's an unseen kingdom, at least for now. That is going to interact back and forth, as we're going to see at the end of today. We're going to kind of lead us into a discussion of how this plays out personally, but there's always an interaction between faith and affliction. That's why St. Paul goes through the list of all of the saints of the Old Testament, or the key saints that we're about to explore here. And what I'm hoping will frame our examination of what St. Paul is saying through the help of St. John Chrysostom is these two arrows, that there's going to be a back and a forth. Sometimes I think we just think of faith as a static, almost like a commodity. There's a static thing called faith, and you either have it or you don't, or you have some of it and you don't. And if you have a lot of it, that's awesome. And if you don't, well, too bad, so sad, and maybe you should get more, and as if it's a commodity. But what we have to understand is faith grows or shrinks as it is in relationship with how we're experiencing affliction. That's why that beautiful passage when the father of the troubled boy says to the Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, right? And as so many other times in the Gospels, St. John Chrysostom points this out so many times. There's so many times in the Gospels where, as an example, even in just his commentary for last Sunday's Gospel of the paralytic, he says, isn't it interesting that in some cases the Lord heals the soul first and then he heals the body, and in other cases he heals the body and then the soul? And he says in this particular instance of the paralytic, he doesn't ask him for a statement of faith first. He commands him to rise, and the faith, as that command is issued, sort of arises inside of the soul of the paralyzed man and expresses itself in the form of the healing. There's always that interaction between the afflicted paralytic and his faith, and vice versa. And you can go through all kinds of examples. Another good example is the blind man. When the Lord heals him and says, what do you see? And he says, I see men as trees walking, right? And then he prays for him again, and then he sees fully. St. John explains that the reason that this happened wasn't because there was some sort of deficiency in the Lord's grace. It had to do with the fact that the man's faith went from kind of 0 to like 35 and then 60. And it took a couple of stages. That's why he's like, I see, sort of, but that was only because of his faith growing from one stage to the other. You see it in the encounter with St. Photini, the Samaritan woman. She goes from one stage to the next. The blind man, one stage to the next. The paralytic, one stage to the next. St. John, the evangelist, really emphasizes this. You can look at the entire Gospel of John and see it's this concept of progression of faith. And the important thing to remember is the mechanics. So what we're trying to look at, we're looking at it like this is we're becoming trained in a certain kind of specialist mechanics field, where we're learning how to fix motors that are very, very specialized. That's what we're doing here. The mechanics of that progression, of all those examples we saw, has to do with this: that there's faith as a substance, but not a static entity, and how it will interact in the soul of any given person, or collectively as the people of God, with the inevitable affliction that comes from sin. Because sin will have to be dealt with, and that's the first sentence in the 12th chapter that we're getting to next time. That is going to be the focus of what will either enhance or foul up the smooth interaction of faith and affliction. We'll see that later, but in a nutshell, it's going to involve affliction with sinlessness or near sinlessness becomes a great catalyst. It just accelerates faith to great heights. A great example of that is Panagia. Her sinlessness was achieved with such speed as a child. She was born with fallen nature, as we teach, but she achieved, as St. Gregory Palamas says, this level of theosis at such a young age, this perfect union with God, as insofar as that was possible before the incarnation, that she still experienced affliction. That's seen by the fact that the Feast of the Dormition, in the Feast of the Dormition, she does actually die. She's not a different class of human being. So she experiences affliction, but she's not experiencing the affliction that stems from sin in our life. That's a different issue. That's when what she experienced was basically like a crucifixion for others, because her heart was so pure. So, and that's why in her case, the faith affliction interface was just supercharged. It was just ultra power charged. In the case of a lot of us, this faith affliction interaction gets fouled up because of the presence of sin that makes this messed up. But whether you're talking about Panagia or you're talking about the worst sinner here, it's still the same dynamic, and it still renders life as an exodus. And that's, need to look no further than the texts for the Feast of the Dormition of the Mother of God to see that in place. So let's jump into the list. Again, I'm presuming that you have read, or you have at least in front of you, the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews. The New King James Version is what we use as found in the Orthodox Study Bible. So I'm not going to read those texts now because I'm trying to keep the file size for this video as small as possible. I suppose it would be even more efficient if I didn't blabber so much, but hey, what can I say? It's me we're talking about, right? So, jumping into Abel, the first mention of the faith list that St. Paul gives. I hope you can read this. It looks like from my monitor you can, but this is a very interesting point right out of the chute here. So St. John Chrysostom is saying, okay, so Abel, meaning he, honored God and died because he honored him, and has not yet attained to a resurrection. But his readiness is manifest, and his part has been done, but God's part has not yet been carried out towards him. In other words, he's speaking about Abel's offering, which was a pure and righteous offering, and that he dies because of the jealousy of Cain, and yet that doesn't change the fact that he is still going to offer a pure offering. I mean, one can only assume that Abel's relationship with Cain had to have been strained. It's not like just out of nowhere. Like, hey, everything's hunky-dory. Woo! What's going on, bro? What are you doing, man? I'm going to go out in the field, catch some game. Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to, get some produce. And, all right, man. Oh, what a brother you are. Gosh, I just can't imagine life without you, man. Oh, the feeling is mutual and 10 times over, man. And they go off arm in arm into the sunset. Hey, Mom, Eve, what's for dinner? Is that the relationship of Abel and Cain? One can only assume that Abel's faithfulness to God didn't come out of a vacuum. It was building, and that culminated in that offering that was righteous and acceptable before God. And Cain's not so righteous offering also didn't come out of a vacuum. It's not like everything was good and then all of a sudden he's like, hey, I'm going to give God a stinky offering today, and then suddenly I'm going to hate my brother too. Like, it doesn't work that way, which means their relationship would have already had the effects of sin in them. There would have been strain and affliction in their own relationship, which is why Abel could have built up righteousness and Cain could have built up the effects of sin that culminated in the moment of the offering, of the righteous or the not so righteous offerings. So that's why St. John Chrysostom is celebrating the faith of Abel. We can't, just because the book of Genesis only records these little moments in time, we can't assume that that's all that happened. So that's why St. John Chrysostom is celebrating Abel's faith, because it was built up over the course of a very righteous life that culminated in the moment which then led to his murder by his own brother. The key point that St. John is saying, therefore, when you understand the background of his faith is, hey, look, God's part was not yet carried out towards him. St. John is building towards a comparison between what the righteous of the Old Testament, and especially this particular list, on the one hand, and us after the coming of Christ on the other. They didn't actually even have a clear picture of what was to come. The kingdom, resurrection, death being destroyed, joy eternal, the oneness of the saints, all of that. That's presumed by us, but it's almost impossible for us to kind of place ourselves in the state of mind and state of soul, really, that Abel and Abraham and all of the rest that are mentioned here were in. That's what St. John is trying to say. So then he says this: he therefore, who by both word and deed bore witness to the righteous man, and sees him slain for his sake, did not avenge him, but left him to suffer. Meaning, so where was God? Hello, my brother killed me, and like Abel's soul could say as it was being separated from his body, like, what the heck? I was righteous. I followed, your will. I loved you. What? But your case is not such, meaning he's speaking to us, the pleroma of the church. For how could it be? You who have both prophets and examples and encouragements innumerable and signs and miracles accomplished, meaning he's talking about Christians who've lived through, at his time, a couple of 100 years of Christianity and all of that. Hence, that was faith indeed, meaning that is Abel. Because he didn't have a concept of the resurrection as a reward. That's why he has faith. That's why it's celebrated by St. Paul here. Faith without even expectation of anything. We're going, okay, there's an if-then going on with us. Like, if I live a life of faithfulness, then I will get to enjoy paradise, right? Sometimes that's kind of what it can boil down to for us. But where was that stated for Abel? And later, as we're going to see, Enoch, who knows about the story of Abel, is like, well, there's no recompense for Abel, so why am I going to follow God here? That's when it gets even stronger, as St. John is going to say. But by contrast, we do know about the resurrection. We do know Christ destroyed death. We know about all the miracles. We've met holy people. We've seen these things in our life. So there's the comparison. So it should be easier for us to stay steadfast in faith than it was for all this list of the Old Testament saints that St. Paul gives. So here comes Enoch, the next on the list in Hebrews 11. Speaking about Enoch, St. John explains, he says not to himself, what need of toils and dangers? Abel honored God, yet he did not protect him. For what advantage had he that was departed from the punishment of his brother? And what benefit could he reap therefrom? Let us allow that he suffers severe punishment. What is that to him who has been slain? He neither said nor thought anything of this kind. But passing beyond all these things, he knew that if there is a God, certainly there is a rewarder also, although as yet they knew nothing of a resurrection. But if they who as yet know nothing of a resurrection and see contradictory things here, meaning the contradiction of Abel honored God, but he didn't get protected, like, what? Thus please God, how much more should we? Meaning, we do know there is a resurrection. For they neither knew of a resurrection nor had they any examples to look to. This is why St. Paul is identifying Abel and Enoch as those who are examples of faith. Again, faith is what? It is the substance of those things hoped for. It's a real concrete thing that we are experiencing that is in relation to the thing that is not it is concrete, but we don't sense its reality as much because it's a hidden kingdom right now. That's what the substance of faith is, the evidence of things not seen, or that conviction over things not seen, as we saw last week. So what St. John is saying is they didn't even necessarily have any concrete evidence to even roll the dice and have that faith and have that conviction, and yet they still did. We have like tons and tons, and even more so because St. John lived in the 4th century. Here we are in the 21st, so we have all those 17 centuries, even more than St. John Chrysostom did. So, St. Gregory Palamas, in his homilies, is going to give us kind of a big picture. The big picture meaning that it's a completely separate homily. It's actually his homily on the Ascension. It has nothing to do with this text in question necessarily, but he addresses some of the same figures that we've been looking at, and more importantly, I think he gives a nice summary of the plan of salvation. And the reason I put this in here is, even though it may feel like it's only it only has a tertiary relationship to this list of Old Testament saints and their faith, I feel like it's a primary relationship, and this is why. Because the more we understand that God has in fact a plan of salvation, as opposed to just a random series of events that we sort of string together in a kind of personal narrative, but rather on God's end, not on our end, not where we're like, oh, God did this, and then later on he did that, and here's what he did there, and I guess that kind of means he loves us sort of in some sort of randomized way. That's not how we approach it in the Orthodox Church. We approach it as the Fathers approach it, which is a singular thread, right? The plan of salvation, an arc. That is a absolutely intentional arc on God's part, a very clear line to bring humanity from its condition of sin after the fall to the glorious resurrection and ascension of human nature and the kingdom that has no end. In other words, Exodus, an exodus from death to life. It is intentional and it is clear on God's end, not just a series of random interventions on his end that we Christians and before us Jews strung together in a narrative of our own making. That is the big difference between those who kind of follow the ideology of, let's say, Joseph Campbell, if you're familiar with him, right? This kind of the power of myth and those, so many of those, Teilhard de Chardin and the perennialists, and we could go on and on about that, but the main the main point there is that they say the inverse of what we just said. There's no actual plan of salvation because, first of all, if there is some kind of divine being, we don't know anything about it, and it's probably just the sum of our collective consciousness at that. So what Joseph Campbell and company, their point is, hey, look, this is just a series of experiences that humans have had in all the ages throughout all of the places on the earth, and we have strung together certain narratives about the stars and the moon and the sun and the origin of humanity and where history is going and the animals and the birds and the sea and all of that there happen to be some sort of common characteristics. And if you look at some of Joseph Campbell's work, like for example his multi-series interview with Bill Moyers that was produced back in the 1980s, that was very popular and influential. It's also very insidious because it reverses the teaching that the saints have always taught, which is not that humans have stumbled upon certain patterns, like the Babylonian creation myth and the Cherokee creation myth and the Jewish creation myth. All have these things in common. How could they have things in common if it weren't this sort of common longing amongst humans in all places and times for the answers to our origin? And so we came up with these kind of similar stories, and that's why, because they're all figments of our imagination. That's their argument, and therefore they're trying to undercut a faith in the total inverse of that, which is the plan of salvation. It's like, look, buddy, whether you recognize it or not, God does exist, and he does have a clear and coherent plan of salvation, which he has executed from the ages and could bring to a completion on the day he returns. And if there's similarities between cultures, the Cherokee, the Babylonian, the whatever, all the creation myths or whatever, that's only because they actually had some kind of perception of the reality that has occurred. They didn't necessarily know the details because they didn't necessarily have the benefit of revelation that the Jews had. And so if they sort of intuitively discern some kind of pattern, then God bless them. That's what God did, as St. Paul says in another place. He did not leave anyone without witness. So it's that those cultures, because he loves them, they somehow discerned the truth of that plan of salvation, the objective plan of salvation, not the subjective fictions of men. So it's just this inversion that is tragic, because a lot of people take that and say, see, you Christians or any religious people, you guys, you use religion as a crutch because you're standing before the roaring sea that is life, and you need some kind of shelter. But the brave, the wise, the smart don't need that. But if you need the crutch of religion or whatever, okay, fine. That's basically what's said. Well, I'm sorry, but St. John, I mean, that's all well and good, my friend and my neighbor, or the guy I'm talking to on the plane, but I can listen to you, or I can listen to St. Gregory Palamas, and St. John Chrysostom, and St. Paul, and the Apostle John, and so on. Like, really? Do you think you're that credible? I'm sorry, but I'm just not buying that. So, in the meantime, I am buying St. Gregory Palamas, and this is what he has to say. The objective. Now, I can see on my monitor it's not clear, so I'm going to read it. When Satan, who broke away and refused to obey God, fell from the light, embraced darkness, and was condemned to eternal gloom, he became a vessel of darkness, its creator, author, and minister, initially for himself and the angels who fell with him. Then, alas, also for us in God's paradise, when we rebelled against God and believed the devil. However, all the wicked angels are darkness in themselves and did not become evil just by sharing the devil's darkness. They are the origin and perfection of disobedience, the bitter root and source of all sin, and, in particular, they were the cause of our own transgression. Therefore, their sin is unpardonable. They grow ever more uncontrollably dark, progress toward their own destruction and will not return to the enlightener of angels and men. Okay, well, that's not good. We, by contrast, did not become evil on our own initiative. God's chastening came upon us with mercy from the beginning. So he's making the distinction between the fallen angels, the demons, and human beings who fell through deceit, not through a knowing fall. There's a big difference there. Now I know this might be like, well, what does this have to do with this whole faith thing? But we're leading to another dimension here that I mentioned earlier, and that's the inescapable presence of sin, because sin is the thing that led to the condition that we find ourselves in after the fall, that hides that kingdom, that longed for goal. Hence the role of faith, right? Now, I know that in some of you are instantly going to be like, so does that mean there was no faith before the fall, or there will be no faith in the kingdom of heaven because we see him? And understood correctly, I think you'd have to be precise, and I don't want to get into a big thing on that, but understood properly, the answer would be no. Because as if you look in the book of Revelation, he says there is no need of a sun or a moon, for the Lord himself illumines that city, right? He shines, and there is no evening in that city. In other words, there is no more unseen kingdom. Now, if we were going to discuss it, which we're not, but if we were, we would still have to introduce the principle that God's essence is forever unknowable, and that life in the eschaton, or the kingdom, eschaton meaning that the time of the perfection is still dynamic, and the kingdom, the bride of Christ, will be forever moving in a kind of mystagogic journey deeper and deeper into the mystery of the Holy Trinity without ever knowing his essence, but without the presence of sin and without the presence of that hiddenness, that relationship between faith and affliction that we find ourselves in on this side of the second coming. So there's a lot there, and the unknowability of God and all that are in play. So there's a ginormous asterisk there when it comes to this issue of, is there going to be faith in the kingdom, or was there faith before? But we'll leave that to maybe a different time when I have more direct input from the fathers to express that, which I do not hear. Nevertheless, God's chastening came upon us with mercy from the beginning. Although we have been condemned to death, it comes after that period of many years appointed for repentance, which Adam survived after the transgression, and which each one of us must undergo. I'm going to read that again in case you can't read it. It's this underlined. Although we have been condemned to death, it comes after that period of many years appointed for repentance, which Adam survived after the transgression, and which each of us must undergo. Okay? So there's a really, really rich point that St. Gregory is making here. Because he raises, I can't remember if he raises it here, if I read it elsewhere, but it didn't include it. Forgive me. I think it didn't include it. But he says, well, if it could have just been, if there was no journey, if there was not going to, I'm using the word exodus, but if there was no journey from death to back to life, from through the action of repentance, which is therefore the journey of faith, which is our primary concern here. If there wasn't going to be that, then St. Gregory says somewhere else in this sermon that Adam would have just died. Like, it would have been like that. Like, you sinned, and like forever death, that's it. And he's just like spinning down into the abyss with Eve screaming their heads off for eternity. And then God just kind of, puts up the screen and is like, turn off the projector, the movie's over, humanity's toast, and this was a wasted experiment. That's what St. Gregory, I'm paraphrasing a lot, of what St. Gregory is saying that about how God did not do that. He did not introduce eternal perdition at the very moment of sin. That rather, as he says here, Adam survived, meaning there's the sin, and yet he continued his existence to a endpoint that is death, the separation of soul and body. But that's what is Exodus. This survival from the transgression until death itself. Okay, that's the whole game. That's everything. That's what St. Paul is getting at when he sort of ensconces the Exodus theme at the chiastic core of this particular chapter. It's really key, because it's sometimes it may be like, whoa, wait, what? To even speculate, but think about it for a second, what he says. What if God was like, okay, Adam and Eve, you sinned, toast, over. It was an all or nothing scenario, right? That completely changes the entire nature of humanity to begin with. Because then we would have either been go, no go from the moment. And then, of course, there would be no more humans. There would have been Adam and Eve, and that's it. So this gets down to the very essence of life itself, the very essence of human nature itself. That even though we bear the mark of sin upon us, and that we are carriers of broken, sickened human nature, we still, as he says here, survive. What is that survival? It is our exodus from death to life. What does that automatically introduce? Faith. It automatically introduces faith. Because if God is not going to condemn us the moment we sin, and really ultimately it would just been Adam and Eve, that's going to mean a period, an in-between period, between the time of sin and the time of the full consequences of sin, which is bodily death. That's the whole game. And thank God that he didn't condemn us right off the bat. Because if he did, then of course we wouldn't be even having this conversation, and the whole point of his coming in the flesh would have been moot. But it's not. And so we find ourselves in this very unique situation where we experience the reality that we are, as St. Gregory says, condemned to death, meaning we've introduced non-life into us, as per our discussion a few sessions ago about the nature of sin, and yet we're still alive. We're still living and breathing and eating. So what does that mean? What it means is life becomes exodus. We are experiencing the effects of sin, and yet what awaits us is a resurrection through the coming of Christ in his saving work. So that's why St. Gregory then later says, all our life is a season of repentance. For God desires not the death of the sinner, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. That is quoted in the Sacrament of Confession, actually. So, for if there were no hope of turning back, why would death not have followed immediately? Oh, there it is, on disobedience. And why would we not be deprived of life as soon as we sin? For where there is hope of turning back, there is no room for despair. What a beautiful sentence. There's an answer to Joseph Campbell, with all respect. I mean, he's a brilliant man, and I wish his soul well. But this is such a beautiful sentence. For where there is hope of turning back, there is no room for despair. That is why we are discussing this in light of the issue of faith. Because faith is the thing that undergirds that Exodus journey from death to life. That's why it's in play. But if we understand faith in that kind of static way, as a commodity, we can talk about faith and sort of experience faith or whatever in a way that doesn't even actually necessarily relate to the fact of the devil's disobedience, the angels, the fallen angels becoming demons, our disobedience through deception, and then all the the story that each of us the story of each of our lives, which is the story of our Exodus. That we're conceived in sin, as Psalm 50 says, and yet we are destined for life eternal because we are baptized and have faith in the one who came, experienced the consequences of that sin and disobedience, triumphed over them in the grave, and rose from the dead and ascended to heaven and will come again. That is what makes every moment in our life have meaning when it comes to the question of faith. Because our faith is saying, okay, I find myself in that context, this context of Exodus. So unlike those who don't have faith, who do not have a conviction of that unseen kingdom which is to come, which is the first fruits of Christ's resurrection, they are going to go through their time of Exodus to a land not flowing with milk and honey, but to a land that's bitter and filled with dread. That's why we're talking about faith. And that's why St. Paul is talking about faith. Because faith is that substance conviction that's going to drive us in the same context as those without faith. We're all subject to it. But those with faith are going to be propelled forward by that conviction, the word that the evidence of things not seen, as we saw earlier. Okay, so Saint Gregory, continues in an analysis of Abel, as you can see here. Adam's son Abel seemed well pleasing and acceptable to God from the very beginning. So he is also affirming that he's faithful. Then, not long after our fall, Enoch, or Enos, hoped to call upon the Lord. As for Enoch, he not only pleased God, but was also taken by him, becoming a clear sign of his compassion towards his fallen men. So the point here is he's affirming St. John Chrysostom's teaching about the faith of Enoch by saying he not only pleased God. And why did he please God? As we saw earlier, because Enoch, or Enos as it's spelled here, he didn't say, well, what's with the no answer on Abel? Like, okay, I guess I'm not going to go for the God thing because clearly there was no answer there. Abel got murdered by his brother, end of story. Well, that's what's the basis of his righteousness. So he says, once more sin gained momentum, and so on. So now he continues and goes through Noah. I'll let you read this on your own, and his faith, and then he mentions the faith of Abraham being well-pleasing to God, and goes through the patriarchs, which this sentence here is gonna have a corresponding relationship to the text, the chiastic structure of the text of Hebrews 11. So look on this slide here. Look at the corresponding figures on the slide that gives the chiastic structure of Hebrews 11, and you'll see how St. Gregory is framing all of this. So, of course, St. Gregory now proclaims the incarnation of Christ, and here I'm so happy because I always use the phrase "plan of salvation," and here in this sermon, here he says, he fulfilled the whole mysterious plan of salvation. I was like, yes! St. Gregory used that phrase, woo! Because, it's one of those, wow, Father Seraphim's always saying the plan of salvation, the plan of salvation. And here it is. I'm quoting St. Gregory and the Anaphora of St. Basil the Great. So there. So for those of you who are always, always muttering in the back of class saying, oh, here goes Father Seraphim and his plan of salvation stuff. I submit unto thee the words of St. Gregory Palamas. So there. So, here's the big so. Sin led to this alienation. The exodus from alienation to our homeland is life, meaning our life in this fallen world. Faith is that substance which undergirds the hidden reality of that homeland, the kingdom of God. So that's putting the two saints together. And we're going to kind of start to close this out soon with this is my summary. So take it or leave it. But enduring afflictions, because we have that conviction of God's recompense in the kingdom, that's what we're the first Hebrews 1, the first verse, that conviction of God's his recompense. That's hearkening back to Saint John Chrysostom when he was saying, if Enoch and Abel had faith, even though they didn't expect a recompense or didn't know that there was any kind of recompense, they still believed that there would be, even though it wasn't stated to them, a recompense of joy eternal, right? That I would also direct you to read in the story of the Maccabees. It's in the what we call the Apocrypha, or the Deuterocanonical books. It's the feast of the Maccabean martyrs, and their feast is on the 1st of August. And every year I read that at the Vespers for that feast. It's so beautiful and touching, heartrending. You know, when the 7 brothers all go to being, you know, their limbs are cut off and their eyes gouged out and they're fried alive in this huge frying pan, all in front of their mother Salome. And in that text, in the very last, one of her sons, who's going to go to execution, he's the youngest one. She encourages him to go to his martyrdom rather than eat pork and break the laws of their fathers. And what does she say there? It's so beautiful, because I will receive you back again in a resurrection. It's so powerful. And it's one of those moments in the Old Testament, one of the few actually, where the bodily resurrection is explicitly stated. And it's on that basis, along with a few other texts, that the Pharisees and the Sadducees had a debate, because, as you know, the Pharisees did believe in a resurrection, the Sadducees did not. And that was one of those source texts. So that vague sense of recompense that the righteous listed here in Hebrews 11 had, there was a little bit more of a sense of recompense probably for Abraham, because he was told that, you know, his children would be as the sands of the sea and the stars of the heavens. But nevertheless, none of them had as concrete a promise of recompense as we do today, which is why St. John Chrysostom said what he said. Like, come on, you guys. They didn't even really have a clear idea of the recompense, and they still had this incredible faith. We do. We have seen in many ways the actual concrete evidence of those things hoped for. So how much more should we have that burning faith to propel us forward through the journey of our exile from him, through this exodus that is life, to the promise of recompense? Okay? That's what the that whole section is, and which is why, kind of to conclude this here, I think probably it will be best to leave the strangers and sojourners material for a little bit later. That's all these slides I'm sort of scanning through. We'll kind of pick those up next time. I'm already pushing 50 minutes here, and I'm trying to manage the upload here. But that perplexing statement at the end of this passage, which, as we mentioned, at least I hope I mentioned, is read on the Feast of All Saints, which will be coming up, you know, in June. That they were sawn in two and all this kind of stuff, and he mentions they did not receive the promise, right? All of them, as righteous as they were, did not receive the promise that they would not be made perfect apart from us, right? That's what's so perplexing about it. But it's not because God's like, well, as awesome as they were, sorry, too bad. I'm a New Testament kind of God. That's not what he's doing. It's so that we would be convicted that look at their faith without a clear sense of recompense. Look at our faith when we do have a clear revelation about our recompense, which is eternal life in the kingdom of God. How much more then we should be propelling ourselves forward through our exodus than even they did, because we know, right? And so that their perfection not being made perfect apart from us has to do with the fact that no one could be perfected unless Jesus Christ, who is the eternal God, became man. Because that would be perfection by bootstraps, right? If the righteous of the Old Testament listed here would somehow become perfect. That's impossible. The union between between the uncreated and the created could only have been brought about through the fiat and initiative of the uncreated. No, there's no way it could have happened through the fiat and initiative of the created. If that were the case, then they could have been made perfect apart from us. But by us, it doesn't mean that we're superior. It means that us are, meaning the people of God who have been called to Him in Christ. That's what it is. It's a proclamation of the incarnation, not a proclamation of how awesome we are compared to those losers back in the Old Testament. So to speak. So to conclude here, this is the sort of the setup for next time. And so the same graphic, but I added one little thing here, which is the problem of sin. I alluded to this at the beginning, but the issue of faith and affliction in this interactive sort of relationship that they have. As we mentioned, Panagia, she's a good example because she does have the effect of affliction because she's truly human. She's not a different class of human being. She experiences the affliction of our condition, but not because of her voluntary sins, because she became purified of those sins rapidly in her childhood. So she's not adding her own sinfulness to her fallen nature, but she's still experiencing the affliction of fallen nature, okay? But the rest of us now, we're trying to get to that stage where we're not going to be freed from affliction just by having faith, contrary to the teaching of, I'm sure, well-meaning people that are Christians, that's prosperity gospel and all. Like, just believe in the Lord Jesus and your life's going to be awesome. No, your life is not going to be awesome. The Lord said the complete opposite. He said you will be hated by all, and you have to bear His cross. And you will have houses and all that stuff with afflictions, as He said. So no, just even if your faith is super strong, that doesn't. You can't escape the affliction dynamic. It's always together. Therefore, this prosperity notion is, for lack of a better word, bunk. So, with all due respect. So, the issue, though, for us is going to be, as St. Paul is going to introduce in the first verse, I think, of the 12th chapter, next time's session, is going to be this problem of sin. Because sin's going to foul up this relationship. The goal is to go through our exodus in life as free of sin as possible, like Panagia or the great saints. So we're experiencing that affliction in a way that Christ did, where we experience the consequence of sin, but not because of our own personal sin, because we've put that away. That's part of our journey, our exodus is, hey, I got to put away my own sin, not so that I can just have the prosperity life, but rather to experience the affliction proper to our fallen world and our fallen nature in a Christ-like way that renders me co-crucified for humanity as I follow Jesus Christ. That's our goal. Ideally, we will increasingly achieve that goal through the days of our exodus in this life, in the near term, soonish, whatever that means, rather than always putting it off. Because we have a job to do for the rest of humanity, which is to put away sin so we can experience the affliction of our brothers and sisters that in a pure way, like Panagia did, the sword piercing through her own soul, as St. Simeon foretold. That's what that was. And so what the benefit to us, if there's an incentive, if you want to put it that way, the incentive is the more we put away sin, the more efficiently this dynamic operates, like the machine, I guess. And the awesome thing is that our faith becomes more and more hot. It just starts to burn and therefore becomes more and more palpable. And that's what is such a joy to experience, that when our faith increases, that means we are more and more, getting back, sorry about the quick slide all the way back to the original graphic here. Here it is. As faith becomes stronger and more and more pervasive, the things not seen become more directly experienced. That's what explains that sense you get when you're around people who really do have faith, a strong faith. Where it's like, wow, there's a joy emanating from them, because that the joy doesn't come out of nowhere. It's because the faith is making them access the things not seen. That conviction becomes stronger because that kingdom becomes more and more seen, more and more directly experienced, the more faith is strengthened. And the way that faith is going to be strengthened is by putting away sin so that we can experience affliction, aka the cross of martyrdom for our fellow man, thus rendering our life the carrying of our cross and fulfilling the words of the gospel when the Lord said that no greater love has this than a man lay down his life for his brother, or the final words of St. John the Apostle, the beloved disciple, when he said, "Brethren, love one another." So faith, love, conviction, crucifixion, exodus, they're all linked together. So on that note, your assignment is to take all of those words. Here it is. This is the last slide. You ready? Here it comes. How would you do a mental map of these? Faith, affliction, exodus, sin, crucifixion, and finally, love. Your assignment, should you decide to accept it, or even if you don't decide to accept it, your assignment is going to be to try and create an explanation for how all these things would connect. Can you connect those two? 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 And here we go. Watch this. Some of you saw this coming, didn't you? I know you did. How's he going to get from crucifixion to faith without going through Exodus? Huh? Well, I did it, folks. So that, I think, would be, I know it's complicated, but maybe do a couple at a time. But I think this would be a super, super cool graphic to get back to on a somewhat regular basis, and build a kind of a library in your mind or even in your own journaling of how these would be connected. Like, pretend that it was a test. Maybe you won't get to pretend. Maybe I actually will make it a test. And actually articulate each of those. I think that would be very, very helpful, because this is basically our Orthodox Christian life. It's at least one way of describing it. All right, guys, we'll see you next time. Sorry for posting this on Wednesday instead of Tuesday. The craziness continues.